Good morning to everyone. So let's get started to today's presentation titled The Gender, Climate Change and Nutrition Integration Initiative, or GCAN, a framework for analysis and programming. This talk today brings us full circle. Almost a year ago, we gave a similar presentation through AgriLinks, focusing on elements that are needed and linkages that need to be made to ensure that we can sustainably reduce global hunger, malnutrition, and poverty without shortchanging women's empowerment and nutritional outcomes. Between the original presentation and today, we spent almost a full year consulting with USAID missions, partners, and many others through presentations, conferences, and mission visits on what it takes to achieve the global food security strategy, with a specific focus on climate resilience, gender, and nutrition elements. I am Claudia Ringler, Deputy Division Director of IFPRI's Environment and Production Technology Division. And the next slide that you might be seeing now should show my short bio, and I'm not going to go over the entire bio, but what I just want to say is that I'm actually the coordinator of this initiative. Today, we will hear from 3 speakers introducing the background of the GCAN initiative, the GCAN framework that was developed over the last year for USAID, its missions and partners to support implementation of the global food security strategy, as well as from one partner, Mercy Corps, which has also developed an aligned set of pathways and linkages for its Bridge initiative. The first speaker, and you can see his bio and picture here, is Moffat Ngugi. He's an agriculture development officer at USAID's Bureau for Food Security and works as a senior advisor on climate and environment for food security. He is by background a geospatial ecologist with also background and experience in rangeland management, physical land resources, and agroecology. He will give a few opening remarks from USAID. The second speaker is Elizabeth Bryan. Elizabeth is a senior research analyst at IFPRI, where she conducts policy-relevant research in sustainable agriculture production, natural resource management, small-scale irrigation, climate change adaptation, and gender. Elizabeth will present the GCAN framework. The third speaker is Audrey Anderson from Mercy Corps. Audrey is the Technical Program Director for the Bridge program at Mercy Corps, which focuses on strengthening the integration of gender into 6 resilience-focused programs across 3 countries. She also serves as the co-chair of the Gender and Resilience Working Group, which consists of members from over 35 organizations focusing on the intersection of gender and resilience. She will provide insights on Mercy Corps' Bridge Resilience Program. Following the presentations, we will have approximately 30 to 40 minutes for Q&A. Please type your questions in the Q&A box as they arise. We will try to answer as many of the questions as possible right after the presentations. Also, the event will be recorded as we had 205 registered participants, but we only have 100 slots to actually participate. With that, I'd like to hand over to Moffat Ngugi from USAID's Bureau for Food Security to give us some opening remarks.
Thank you, Claudia. So as you heard, my name is Moffat Ngugi, and just over a year and a half ago, in June 2016, the United States Congress passed the Global Food Security Act as a bipartisan initiative, and this actually set us in motion to actually put together the global food security strategy for 2017-2021, and this is a whole of government effort. So basically, achieving the goals of global food security is going to sort of need to consider actually elevating resilience as a key objective, together with the other objectives of agriculture-led growth and nutrition. And this requires very careful consideration of the interlinkages across climate resilience, gender, and nutrition. To help address these challenges, the USAID Bureau for Food Security asked IFPRI in the fall of last year, 2016, to support USAID and our USAID missions and partners with tools and frameworks on how to better integrate these important topics so that we ensure the outcomes, improving all the three important development areas. So again, climate resilience, gender, and nutrition. And the result is the GCAN project, which among others has developed the GCAN framework. We're going to hear a lot more about that. So the Bureau of Food Security within USAID, along with the regional bureaus, provides resources and technical organizational leadership to coordinate and the implementation of food security programming by country and regional field offices. And BFS's primary focus is on country strategy and implementation, research and development, including also policy, private sector engagement, and of course monitoring and evaluation. So given the recent increase in the number of food insecure for the first time in a while, and mostly linked also to climate change and civil strife, the work that we are doing at USAID is growing in importance. So in a nutshell, really, we wanted to be able to do this work primarily so that we're not addressing whether it's climate change, whether it's issues with nutrition or issues with gender separately, but how do we actually program and take actions jointly? And this framework actually helps us a lot in that. So thank you.
Thank you, Moffat. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. This is Elizabeth Ryan, and I'm going to be discussing the framework that we developed as part of the GCAN project at IFPRI to highlight the linkages between climate change, gender, and nutrition in the context of agriculture and rural development in developing countries. So gender and nutrition are two key areas worth paying extra attention to in development policies and programs. Why is that? Well, first, it's important for the sake of equity. Programs need to ensure that both men and women are benefiting from their programs and that there are no unintended harmful impacts being felt by any particular group of people. In addition, research also suggests that paying attention to the gender and nutrition implications of policies and programs may increase their effectiveness. So in the case of climate smart agriculture, or CSA, for example, paying attention to gender and nutrition also has the potential to achieve other development outcomes, such as improved nutrition and health and women's empowerment, in addition to maximizing gains across the three CSA pillars, which are productivity, adaptation, and mitigation. And because integrating all these cross-cutting themes like resilience, climate smart agriculture, gender, and nutrition can be really quite complex, it can be difficult for donors, policymakers, and practitioners to try and prioritize and identify strategies that will simultaneously achieve multiple development outcomes like food security, environmental security, gender equality, resilience. So because of this, we developed a framework to facilitate decision-making by illustrating the linkages between resilience to climate change, gender, and nutrition. And this framework draws on a review of the literature on gender and climate change, on agriculture to nutrition pathways, climate change and nutrition and resilience. And our review found that studies often look at one or two of these topics, but very few actually look at all three together. So what we did was identify the key elements from these different bodies of research, and we pulled them together into one integrated framework, which is shown here. So the first element, starting on the left-hand side of this figure, is the climate signal. And this can include things like climate shocks, like droughts and floods, long-term stressors like changes in average temperature or rainfall. And the impacts of these climate shocks and stressors are filtered through several other elements in the framework, including the absorptive and adaptive capacity. And adapted from the resilience literature, we define absorptive capacity here as the sensitivity of people at various scales to shocks and stressors given their current livelihood activities, infrastructure, resources, and other factors. Adaptive capacity is the ability to respond to shocks and stressors. And as you can see in the gray box in the middle, these responses can take different forms, including coping responses, risk management responses, adaptive responses, and transformative responses. And these responses take place at different spatial and time scales. The funnel that you see in between these elements indicates that absorptive and adaptive capacity determine, in part, the range of response options that decision makers have. So low absorptive and adaptive capacity means that people may have more limited response choices available to them and vice versa. Another key factor that determines response choices is the decision-making context. People have different preferences, they have different needs and priorities, and their ability to meet their own needs depends on their bargaining power and control over resources, particularly when the interests of different actors and different decision makers are not aligned. And at the bottom of the gray box there, you can see several different pathways through which response choices can influence development outcomes. And these pathways include changes in food production, changes in income, asset dynamics, labor allocation, etc. And these changes affect the broader food, social, health, and living environments, and also specific development indicators such as food and nutritional security, gender equality, health status, and environmental security. And it's important to point out that there are trade-offs across these outcomes. So, for example, farmers may adopt a new agricultural practice that increases food production and availability, but this may come at an environmental cost. And there are also trade-offs across people. So, for example, new climate-smart approaches may increase the labor burden of one group of people or put another group of people out of work, for example, through mechanization. One important environmental indicator to point out is that responses to shocks and stressors can affect the level of greenhouse gas emissions, which contributes to future climate change or mitigates future climate change, as shown by the arrow on the top. Similarly, outcomes that are experienced as a result of shocks and stressors today can affect the capacities of people to respond to future shocks and stressors, as indicated by the arrow on the bottom. Resilience is not shown as an outcome, but as an evolving set of capacities in this framework. And I just want to point out that this framework can be adapted to a particular country context or program to identify specific climate risks and entry points for policies, projects, and approaches to achieve priority outcomes. The framework can also be used to identify indicators to measure outcomes or changes in the key elements. And in this slide, I'm showing a framework that has been adapted to show the kinds of factors that are relevant for decision makers and programs operating at the household level. So here we've identified specific factors that influence absorptive and adaptive capacity at the household level and the types of response options that are available for households. And this is not an exhaustive list, but just to illustrate that how this framework can be used. And similarly, here we have adapted the framework to show the factors influencing absorptive and adaptive capacity at the national level and the kinds of response options that are available to policymakers. So you may be wondering, where is the nutrition in this framework? Much of the literature frames undernutrition as a consequence of climate change through changes in the availability and prices of food and through impacts on production and consumption of healthy foods, as shown in the last red bubble on the slide on the right-hand side. However, nutrition and health status also affect people's ability to respond to climate change by affecting their physical capacity and ability to work, as shown by the first red bubble on the left. In addition, many of the response options have important nutrition implications. So, for example, coping responses like reducing consumption or switching to less preferred foods or selling livestock or other assets may have negative nutrition implications, while other more adaptive or transformative response options, such as irrigated vegetable production, can improve nutrition outcomes. And I want to point out that there may be trade-offs between nutrition outcomes and environmental outcomes, because sometimes changes in diet needed to improve nutrition, such as increased consumption of animal source foods, can also increase greenhouse gas emissions. And I just want to point out also that gender differences can be found in almost every single element of this framework. So there are differences between men and women in terms of their ability to absorb and adapt to shocks and stressors that they're experiencing. Men and women also have different preferences and needs for how they respond to shocks and stressors. And women tend to have less bargaining power and control over decisions at home, in their communities, and in policymaking circles. And the impact of climate shocks and stressors and the responses to them can also affect men and women differently, leading to an increase in gender equity or greater gender inequalities. And finally, differences between outcomes for men and women today can lead to different capacities for men and women to respond to future shocks and stressors. There's emerging research that also shows that men and women may be differentially affected by shocks and by the types of technologies or practices that are taken up to respond to those. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about how we're using this framework and to give some examples of the new gender and nutrition findings from some of the syntheses that we've done in selected countries. First, we've used the framework to guide our interactions with staff in USAID missions in selected countries. And in each country, we review and synthesize the literature, identify research that's been done, and any evidence gaps. And we also use this framework to support the integration of gender and nutrition in climate risk screening activities done by the missions. And currently, we are developing tools based on the framework for project implementers and others to use during the design, implementation, and M&E of their projects so that they can integrate thinking about climate risks, gender, and nutrition together. So I first want to just talk about each element, and the first one is the climate signal. So one thing that we do to support planning using this framework is to highlight both past and future trends in key climate variables for the country or region in which we're working or focusing. So this includes past trends in temperature and rainfall, future projected trends in these variables, and projected impacts on key crops, for example, for the country. So this image shows the historical trend in precipitation for Nigeria. The areas in blue and green are areas where there was a significant change between 1980 and 2010. And the key shows that there's actually been a significant increase in rainfall in the northern part of the country during this time. Projections suggest that this trend will continue into the future. So on the one hand, this could indicate an increased risk of flooding in an area that's already experiencing numerous stressors even in the absence of climate change. On the other hand, this information could be used to identify opportunities for making use of increased rainfall in a very dry part of the country. And now I'm going to turn to absorptive and adaptive capacity. Considering the importance of nutrition not just as an outcome of climate change, but also an important input into determining people's capacity to respond, one thing that we do is develop a nutrition profile for the country or context in which we're working. And this profile pulls together indicators like the level of stunting and wasting, as well as the extent of micronutrient deficiencies such as anemia. And now turning to gender, the literature on gender and climate change identifies significant gender differences in the factors influencing both absorptive and adaptive capacity. And studies show that women have different perceptions of climate change and its impacts that are often related to their unique roles in agriculture in that context. Men and women also have different perceptions of climate change, and these are important because they shape how people respond to shocks and stressors that they're perceiving. Women also tend to have less access to and control over productive resources such as agricultural inputs, natural resources like land and water, which can limit their response options. And women have differential access to agricultural information, which is really important when we're talking about climate change. People need to have access to information about what climate changes they can expect and also what response options are available to them. So as a result of lack of access to information, women tend to be less aware of a range of climate smart practices and less likely to adopt them. Interestingly, though, when we condition adoption on awareness of particular practices, we find that women are just as likely as men, if not more so in the case of some technologies, to adopt those practices. Institutions such as social norms also affect men and women differently. So, for example, women often have difficulty participating meaningfully in groups, or they may be prohibited. Sorry, the slides keep changing on their own, so I apologize for that. They may be prohibited from adopting certain practices that may not be considered socially appropriate for them to use. It's also important to point out that these factors vary depending on the context, which makes it difficult to draw general conclusions about the ways in which men and women are advantaged or disadvantaged. So it's important to really try to identify the most salient factors in a given context where a program or policy is going to operate. And now I'm moving on to the response options and the decision-making context. Because climate change poses risks at all stages of the value chain, it's important to think about the whole value chain and consider responses to climate change that go beyond production practices. This value chain perspective also offers an opportunity to think about ways to enhance nutritional outcomes by minimizing nutrition exiting the value chain and maximizing nutrition entering the value chain at each stage. For example, one study showed that climate change is expected to increase aflatoxin contamination of maize and groundnuts in Zambia. This suggests that both a climate and a nutrition smart strategy would be to focus on improving curing, storage, and processing practices and increasing women's knowledge of aflatoxin risks. Men and women also have different preferences for how they respond to climate change. In general, as I mentioned, women are less likely to adapt to perceived climate change, as shown by the figure on the left from 4 different sites. And this is likely due to the fact that they have fewer response choices, given that they face additional constraints. However, when women do adapt, they often choose different practices than men, although not always. Across the 4 sites shown in this figure, we find that men are more likely to report strategies like planting trees, while women are more likely to mention food storage, starting off-farm businesses, or adopting fuel-efficient cook stoves. Both men and women reported changing crop types and varieties and changing planting dates. Although we didn't collect data on this, there are likely to be differences in preferences for crop types and variety traits between men and women, as has been shown by several other studies. And as I mentioned earlier, research also shows that women tend to have less decision-making authority, even if they report having input into decisions. So some key questions that we need to consider in a given context include, what are the key livelihood roles of men and women? What might specific needs and preferences be for climate-smart agriculture or adaptation in general? How are decisions made in the household and community? And how much input do women have into these decisions? So if women's decision-making is identified as a key constraint, there are programmatic approaches that are being developed to increase women's sphere of influence in decision-making. And I think Audrey is going to touch on this in her presentation. And the agriculture to nutrition pathways literature highlights the ways that agricultural interventions can influence nutritional outcomes, such as through a production pathway and an income pathway. However, nutrition is more than just food. It's driven by diet, health status, care practices, and the environment, such as the wash environment. Responses to climate change can affect all of these things: environmental outcomes, availability of nutritious foods, income, and assets. And I just want to highlight that these pathways are influenced by gender. So women play a critical role in caring for children, the elderly, and the sick, and women's energy expenditure through agricultural labor can affect their ability to provide that care, and also their own nutrition and health status. Women's production and expenditure preferences also affect health and nutrition outcomes. So it's important to think about several key questions related to these pathways in a particular local context. And these include, who makes planting decisions and other production decisions, and what are the implications of those choices for nutritional outcomes? And who controls the income from different activities, and what are the consumption preferences of men and women? If assets are sold to cope with climate shocks or stressors, whose assets are these? And if new production practices are adopted to respond to climate shocks and stressors, what are the labor implications for men and women? And how does this influence women's caring capacity? And finally, I'm going to move on to discuss the outcomes in more detail. So climate change and the responses to it affect nutritional outcomes in part through changes in prices. On the one hand, climate change can result in production losses and increased food prices, which can cause people to adopt coping responses, such as reducing consumption or selling animals that increasingly have negative impacts on nutrition, as shown in the figure. Conversely, the widespread adoption of climate-smart practices along the value chain can lead to lower food prices, greater food availability, and improvements in nutritional outcomes. So this can go in the reverse direction. And another thing that we have to consider is the differences between men and women. So will climate-smart agriculture or other types of adaptation responses taken in response to shocks and stressors actually close or exacerbate gender inequalities? The costs and benefits of climate change responses are not distributed across all household members equally. So how men and women in the household are affected depends on many factors such as the shifts in time burden, changes in control over income, asset gains or losses, changes in consumption patterns of different household members, etc. And as a result, climate smart practices or other strategies do not always facilitate women's empowerment or lower gender gaps. In fact, they may exacerbate them. And this table shows that climate smart practices, in this case, small scale irrigation, is not always associated with women's empowerment. And here we're using the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, or WEA, to measure women's empowerment. And we find that women from irrigating households in Ghana and Tanzania have higher empowerment scores than women from households without irrigation. But the opposite is true in Ethiopia. The WEA results also show that the contributors to women's disempowerment are different in each country. In Ethiopia, community leadership is more of a challenge, while in Ghana and Tanzania, other issues like credit access are more important. So what this suggests is that interventions, such as the introduction of irrigation, will not necessarily lead to women's empowerment unless these interventions are implemented in a way that considers not only how to reach and benefit women, but also to provide opportunities for their empowerment. So what does the framework and the research that we've done applying this framework tell us about how to make climate smart approaches more gender transformative and nutrition sensitive? Well, first, we need to ensure that programs and projects consider how to remove constraints to women's participation in program activities and in decision making at home and in the community. We need to think about men's and women's preferences for how they respond to climate change. And we need to think about how to maximize nutrition outcomes through interventions, not just at the farm level, but across the entire value chain. And we're developing some specific tools mapped to each of these elements in our framework to help our partners integrate gender and nutrition considerations into their climate and resilience programs. And we hope to get some feedback from many of you during the Q&A on how we can make this a more useful tool for your work. And finally, we're also reviewing promising approaches submitted by several partner organizations so that we can compile and share lessons learned about what works and what doesn't. And in a minute, I'm going to turn it over to Audrey, who's going to share Mercy Corps' approach to integrating gender into their resilience programming. But before I do that, I just want to mention that the framework that I presented is just one component of the GCAN project. We're also working with missions in selected Feed the Future countries, so we have information from the work that we've done there. We're engaged in specific research studies on topics related to the linkages between gender, climate change, and nutrition. We're promoting the use of Feed the Future datasets through datathons and student competitions and several other activities. So I hope you will visit our website for more information on the project and what we're doing and download some of our outputs. And there's also a link here for you to sign up to our monthly newsletter if you'd like to get updates on what we're doing. Thank you very much. And I'm going to turn it over to Audrey.
All right, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for that introduction. I'm Audrey with Mercy Corps. I'm the director of our Bridge program. And I'll start with just a little bit about the Bridge program. At Mercy Corps, we were lucky to have a program that's focused primarily on capacity building. So our goal of this program is to increase the capacity of Mercy Corps' program and partner staff to respond to gender-specific vulnerabilities, specifically in the face of natural disasters and climate-related shocks and stresses. And with the Bridge program, we are working in 3 countries. We're in Indonesia, Niger, and Nepal, with 2 different Mercy Corps programs in each country, so 6 in total, in order to provide gender integration support and to develop and pilot approaches to strengthening resilience to climate shocks by taking a gender-sensitive approach. And these 6 programs that we work with across the 3 countries are fairly diverse. They already include a resilience focus in their approach, but they may span USAID food security programs or financial services programs, market systems development programs. They're fairly diverse in both their funding sources, their scope, and their well-being outcomes that they aim to achieve. And so we're often asked why these particular 3 countries, and these countries were chosen based on the fact that they are all particularly vulnerable to different climate and ecological shocks and stresses that are changing and increasing quite rapidly. And furthermore, Mercy Corps has and operates resilience hubs in these different regions with strong programming in each country that already includes resilience focus. So our bridge program it consists of 3 phases. In the first phase, we conducted gender and resilience assessments for each of these programs. And then based on the results of these gender assessments, we developed action plans to address specific gender issues. In the third phase, the learn phase, which we are currently in right now, we're conducting research on gender and resilience and synthesizing learning from the pilots in order to inform the development of toolkits for sharing out and disseminating. So I'll provide a little bit more detail on the gender action plans that we've developed with each of these 3 countries, and focusing on identified gaps through the gender and resilience assessment. And there are some common themes that came out across the different countries. We have household decision-making and women's participation in community groups, particularly in disaster risk management groups, and access to market linkage points in particular. And you'll notice similarities with different aspects of the framework that Elizabeth presented with IFPRI. And these particular topic areas were informed by the bridge assessments that we conducted with the programs, but also rooted in previous research that was carried out by Mercy Corps in 2014 on gender and resilience in the Sahel, that found that these 3 core areas, and more broadly than market access to capital, and assets more broadly, were particularly important focus areas. And this was reinforced through our assessments. So we developed pilot approaches to address each of these 3 thematic areas across the programs, in addition to measurement tools for each of these 3 areas. And currently we have only completed our pilots in Niger so far, so I'll be presenting on what we have at this point. In some cases, these pilots are works in progress. Similarly, for the measurement tools, we've developed and implemented drafts of the tools already, and I'll share the overall approach for a couple of these, but they are still works in progress too. So we'll be sharing out finalized toolkits in another 6 months or so of the program. And throughout this remaining 6 months, we'll finalize these tools intervention approaches. And we are fortunate to be collaborating and working with IFPRI on the remainder of the program to build on their research and their expertise in the area. And this is a brief overview of our theory of change that starts with a gender-based approach to resilience. We have the 3 empowerment pathways here that are then leading to more resilient behaviors at the household and community levels, and overall improved household and community resilience. So these are our 3 pathways again. So we're looking at how these different pathways lead to more resilient behaviors, and I'll go into more detail about each of these a little bit later. But these capacities also contribute to strengthening one another. So for example, when a woman increases her ability to participate in household decision-making, this often allows her the time and freedom to participate in community group activities. And similarly, when a woman has increased access to markets, starts to generate income for herself, this can often affect her ability to participate in household decisions. However, this is not always the case. In some cases, you may see a woman who starts to earn income outside the home and simply turns it over to her husband to manage. And so this is one of the reasons why we need multi-tiered interventions. They're focusing on different aspects. So what does this mean for how we are implementing our programs differently? What specifically are we doing on the ground in order to try to address these different gender-related issues? I will start with equitable household decision-making, and I'll go over, so we've developed measurement tools and pilot approaches for each of these 3 areas. I'll just go over a couple today just for the sake of time, but I'll start with decision-making. And these are a couple of illustrative examples of how equitable household decision-making really leads to improved resilience to climate and ecological shocks and stresses. So when a woman is participating in household decision-making around finances, for example, then that can lead to improved household financial management. Households that may be more financially stable can absorb shocks and stresses. And then similarly, we've seen through some of our studies that when women are participating in household decision-making, particularly sharing issues of the time burden that they're faced with, and are having discussions within the families around sharing household chores, this can lead to increased time for women to participate in income-generating work, which can lead to diversified income sources for the household. So in Niger, we have completed a pilot intervention focusing on beginning to shift household decision-making dynamics within the household level. And this consisted of a three-pronged approach. And at the beginning of the pilot, so we held a 4-day participatory community workshop that we delivered to 25 couples across 8 villages in the different departments where we are working. And in the first half of this workshop, that we conducted the workshop for single-sex groups of men and women separately, and then in the second half, we gathered them together to present out the results from their discussions and to begin to develop plans of action for the household. And then for a number of months following the initial workshops, our field agents conducted follow-up visits with the participants to provide coaching on the action plans and counseling for any issues that came up while the couples were working to make a change. And secondly, we worked to train religious and traditional leaders as central advocates of behavior change. So we worked with imams and village chiefs and other leaders who were then trained and equipped with Islamic arguments based on interpretation from the Quran to defend women's rights and to promote dialogue between spouses. And this picture here, this is Sheikh Bashir. He was our lead religious trainer in Niger. And after the initial training, the religious leaders delivered sermons or teachings on the topics in their community, and confirming the coherence between Islam and between the lessons that were taught by the program staff proved to be perhaps one of the most impactful intervention or aspects of this intervention we produced. And we found that, moreover, this training for the religious leaders had a huge impact on the overall program, which was focused actually on providing mobile financial services. And having the stamp of approval of religious leaders for the program activities proved extremely helpful for promoting uptake of these mobile financial services as well, which is something we had not anticipated from the beginning. And the last major phase of the pilot was the organization of learning days for the communities in order to sensitize the community to reinforce and celebrate out the progress made by participants. And so through sharing sessions, through drama skits, through songs, the participants shared what they were able to learn through the training of the couple. And this in particular proved very useful for extending the effects of the intervention to other participants in the community who were also influenced by the religious leaders and the actions of others. And we are looking now at ways to consider scale of this intervention, because it does require an intense focus an intense dedication of resources per community right now. So we're looking at how we can build on some of these aspects, like the religious leaders training and the sharing, the role model couples, in order to expand this across communities without focusing so much on the individual face-to-face training. And so based on the success of this activity, we're adapting this approach for 2 programs in Nepal called Family Dialogue in Nepal, because we are adjusting the approach to take into account different decision-making dynamics in Nepali households that focus more on involving the entire family. And then how are we measuring household decision-making? And this is definitely a very a tricky thing to measure. It's tricky to develop surveys that are accurately getting at the results or the actual dynamics of household decision-making across households. And we wanted to break down a little bit further how we were approaching household decision-making. So we weren't just looking at participation or not participation. We were actually starting to capture some of the nuances of what decision-making looks like at the household. And so we developed out this scale that goes from first secrecy. So one person makes a decision and doesn't tell the other person. So for example, in the Nigerian context, you might see this as a husband decides to take a second wife, and the wife finds out when she sees the second wife, when she shows up. And so this is at one end of the spectrum, which then moves up to informing. So one person makes a decision, tells the other people about it. Then next, moving to consultation or negotiation. So one person has more of the decision-making power, but they persuade others to accept the decision. Will take into account their input, though, in the decision. And then from there, we move to a variety of different behaviors, but they all encompass women's empowerment and household decision-making. So household members are making decisions jointly or as they choose. There may be flexibility in roles. One person makes a decision because it's more convenient or because they're more interested in the decision, but there is empowerment across the whole dynamics. And In addition, there are a number of other aspects that contribute to how to shifting decision-making dynamics, and then also the connection between household decision-making and resilience to climate and ecological shocks and stresses. So there's often an assumption that increased empowerment in decision-making is directly correlated to increased resilience. And while this is often the case, it's not always the case. So there may be a situation where a woman doesn't have any knowledge of financial literacy, and so we can't work just in the direction of shifting social norms. We also have to address the enabling environment around as well. In many cases, something as simple as having enough money can begin to shift decision-making dynamics. You'll see when a husband feels that he is responsible for making money in the household and there's not enough money, he very understandably doesn't want to sit down with his wife every month and have a conversation about household budgeting. And I'll give, this is a brief testimonial from one of the participants in our Niger pilot, a couples dialogue pilot, and I'll go ahead and read this. She said, "Last week, my husband told me he was going to the market to sell my goat, the goat that I bought with my own money. The first thing that crossed my mind was, is the goat sick? What happened? Why is he telling me this and not just going straight to the market as he always does? The goat was not sick. It didn't die before they reached the market, but for me, it was like dying and being born again. It was the first time that my husband came to me to tell me about his decision beforehand, just for the sake of telling me. It's as if he acknowledges that I exist." And the reason I'm sharing this, besides the fact that I think it's a great testimonial from our program, is that it illustrates actually just moving from secrecy to informing on this level of the household decision-making spectrum. And although our focus may be on reaching higher levels of equity in household decision-making to ensure that women are very active agents of resilience, we can't dismiss how difficult it is to actually start to shift these behaviors and how huge it can be to start to move just from, for example, secrecy to informing. This is a huge shift, like for this woman, made a huge difference in her life, and also can allow us to better plan interventions with reasonable expectations for how dynamics start to shift. So our second pathway is meaningful participation in community groups, particularly DRM groups. And I'll give a little bit of an overview of how this connects to household community resilience, but I'm not going to go into detail in any of our interventions for the sake of time today. But when you can see women starting to increase more meaningful participation in community disaster risk management groups in particular, because these were the ones we were focusing on in particular, these mechanisms, these groups are often the mechanisms in communities for sharing early warning systems, for sharing response information. And when women don't have access to these networks and these groups, then they're completely cut off from the sharing of information around responding to the disaster. And in many cases, when you're seeing husbands who are migrating for many days out of the year and women are left without the access to these informations and networks, then it can be particularly risky for the households and communities. And then secondly, I also included meaningful participation in any community groups can also lead to improved resilience for women simply through improving social capital, through improving their social networks and the friends and connections on whom they can rely in the event of a shock or stress. And I'll move on now to access to market linkages in particular. And I've just got one brief example here. When women have more improved access to market linkages, then they're able to improve their household income, improve diversified livelihoods, have different sources of income for the household. And the example here that I will share is on a Nepal pilot intervention that is in progress now, and we're working particularly within the dairy markets in Nepal. And so market access is very diverse. There is no one size fits all. So this will be very specific examples that relate exactly to the dairy value chain in Nepal, where in Nepal we're considering inclusion factors beyond just sex and age. We're looking at caste discrimination as well, which can often be a much bigger determinant of access than gender. And our programs in Nepal are focusing on the intersection of disaster risk reduction and market systems development. And we've developed a few different approaches for this. The first one here is a price information sharing system. So women and lower caste farmers are often the most excluded from information and thus are often not getting fair prices for their milk. So we're developing a price information sharing system to ensure that excluded farmers have access to standard market prices for their products. And another major issue we faced is discrimination against the lower caste members. Many people do not want to buy milk if they know that it came from Dalits or the lowest caste. So we've developed a few different approaches to begin to address this issue. The first are Dalit demonstration farms. So since many believe that cows that are owned by Dalits will be unhealthy or diseased, we've set up demonstration farms with champion Dalit farmers and organized visits so that others in the community, others in neighboring communities can see healthy cows that are raised by Dalits to start to change the way that people are viewing the lower caste. Although this is a slow process, however, and cultural change takes a lot of time. And so we want to have additional approaches in the meantime to bolster the markets for the lower caste individuals. And one of those is an orientation on ghee processing or clarified butter. Since milk is a liquid, it's often seen as particularly unclean if Dalits have managed it. But this doesn't extend to ghee or the butter to the same extent. And so once the milk has been turned into ghee, it's more viable in the market for the Dalits. So we're developing business orientations and working on the ghee market to promote ghee processing and the connection with the markets for Dalits. And then finally, we have local collection centers in communities for the milk. And this addresses a couple of issues. So women often have limited mobility, and it's difficult for them to travel to milk collection centers that are far outside their community. And then secondly, this also addresses the issue of discrimination against Dalit milk. When it's been collected by a local collection center, the milk all gets mixed together. Main collection centers don't actually know where it came from. So they're able to take the milk and continue along the value chain. And this is a segue to some of our initial learning on our gender and resilience approaches. And again, this is initial learning. Again, we're still partway through the program right now, so we're still synthesizing our key learning, but these are some initial observations. But the multi-tiered programming approach is crucial. And as we can see through the market access examples, we can't just work on shifting social norms and shifting the way that people are viewing the lower caste or are viewing women in the communities, but we need to work on both ends. We need to work on shifting the social norms, but then also work on providing direct access to capital and access to assets in the meantime. And our next learning is the importance of longer-term interventions and research as well. Consistently, we receive feedback that it's not enough time to affect change or to measure, particularly when we're looking at shifting gender relations, which we know take a very long time to change, and also measuring increased resilience, which takes a very long time to measure appropriately as well. And related to that, we also need to have reasonable expectations for outcomes. There can be trade-offs when you're meaningfully addressing gender and inclusion in a program. It takes time and resources that we need to plan for. And in order to really integrate gender meaningfully, we need to do so in our budgets, in our work plans, in our M&E systems, and adjust our targets effectively. Because this is critical for, particularly for building community resilience and resilience at a broader level, is to make sure that we're dedicating the time and the resources to reach the most vulnerable households, the most vulnerable individuals in the systems that we're working in. And then finally, feedback loops between researchers, between implementers. How can we ensure that we're having open conversations so we can feed our learning back into research and vice versa? And so I'm particularly grateful to IFPRI for organizing this webinar so that we can start to have the chance to do that and start to share more. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay. So now we're going to open it for Q&A. We'll check the chat box and see if any questions have come in. If you have a question, please add it to the chat box.
Maybe as you're waiting, I can take the prerogative.
Go for it.
So in terms of the Niger activity, can you kind of comment on how targeting the couple dialogue sort of works in cases of polygamy? Or because I would imagine there are several families that would have multiple wives and such. So who do you target in that instance?
So we worked with the whole household in those instances, but in many cases we were targeting as a pilot, and the people who would participate were the people who were available. And so we would welcome and open it up to both men and to both wives or multiple wives in that instance. But in many cases we would often only get one wife who would attend. But we did see in Niger that there was a huge impact on the households, because we have many families living in the same household, that when we had one couple or a couple of people in the household who were participating in the intervention, that the effects would start to extend across to other members of the household, particularly when the couples who attended were influential or were in positions of power in the household. That, coupled with the religious leaders training as well, started to produce the change in households. And we actually didn't see a huge difference we did see a shift in those who participated in the program versus the neighbors and the community members and other family members. But there wasn't much of a difference in the change across them. We saw a large change in anyone who was within the household of those who participated. Thanks.
Okay. We do have some questions from online. We're just going through them now. Let's see. We have a couple of questions from Ekanath Katiwada. You have mentioned major elements: productivity, adaptation, and mitigation. How do you see the importance of market system strategy in your integrated approach? Okay, so I think this is Elizabeth. I'll go ahead and take that question. When I mentioned productivity, adaptation, and mitigation, I was referring to the 3 pillars of climate smart agriculture. So climate smart agriculture is essentially a framework for evaluating different strategies and approaches across these 3 pillars. And what we've tried to do with the GCAN framework is to also extend a couple of more pillars to that, to also look at things like gender and nutrition. And one of the things that we think is important, and I think the nutrition element really brings this out, is the importance of seeing climate smart agriculture not just as a set of practices that are adopted at the farm level affecting production, but also as approaches that go beyond production to look at other stages of the value chain. So you can think about infrastructure, market linkage, as Audrey had mentioned, processing, storage, other kinds of practices that help reach nutrition goals and also are climate smart, because as I mentioned, climate change is not only affecting the production side, but it affects other stages of the value chain. So you have to take this more holistic approach to looking at the kinds of strategies that are available for a household or a community or a policymaker. And the next question that you had was, what is the minimum timeline to implement the framework on the ground in order to get some intended impacts? So the framework, as we've designed it now, is more a useful tool for discussion with our partners and with missions to try and synthesize available evidence that we have for a certain context, to identify gaps, and to help integrate these kinds of concepts around climate risk and resilience, nutrition, and gender into decision making at that level. But we do hope to take it to another stage where these kinds of tools can be developed for implementing partners to use on the ground. So when they're designing an intervention or they're monitoring the impacts of an intervention, they think about looking at things like nutrition and looking at the gender impacts of their program. So this is still a work in progress. And this collaboration that we have with Mercy Corps is sort of one first attempt at aiming to really get down into a specific intervention and trying to work together to integrate research and learning from the actual interventions.
But I would also add that maybe from a USAID perspective, that in kind of thinking about activity planning and project design and so on, this is a useful framework to really kind of hit sort of the right the right considerations for nutrition, for gender, and certainly for climate and environment issues. So that's also another layer where the product that's coming off of this activity, the framework and the platform that's coming off of this project would be relevant and a useful framing for the planners and designers.
Yeah, thank you, Mofat. I'm going to go to a next question by Harley Stokes. Where can we find the nutrition profiles? One thing that we've done is in the missions that we've supported already, we developed a PowerPoint presentation which summarizes the sort of synthesis that we've done. And so we would have information about the nutrition profiles for the countries that we have worked in, about sort of the climate trends that I mentioned. So if you visit our website, gcan.ifpri.info, you can find these PowerPoints and other policy briefs that are based on these PowerPoint slides for a selected set of countries. So far we have Bangladesh, Cambodia, Zambia, and Nigeria available for you to take a look at. Let's skip to one for the bridge program, maybe. Yeah, the bridge program. Okay, so there's a question by Laura Cooper Hall. The bridge program is incredibly interesting, especially considering how context specific it is. Could you possibly provide a bit more detail on how nutrition was linked to resilience in the Niger pilot?
Sure. So with the Niger pilot around household decision making, nutrition was not actually a major aspect of this program. We did work with another food security program, so we are addressing issues of nutrition, but this was not actually a direct component of the pilots in these areas. These were looking at the broader scope of the programs that are meant to, in many cases, lead to better nutrition as an overall outcome, and then already had very complex results chains built out that they were already doing. And so Bridge, our program, came in and identified gaps that were really preventing women from participating in any program activities that were leading to this. And so that was, it's really indirectly involved. We weren't necessarily focusing directly on nutrition through some of these pilots, but it was an overall outcome of the programs that we were working with. And I saw another question on there too about how we approach the religious leaders. I'll go ahead and answer that one too. We found that religious leaders were actually extremely interested in participating. It was one of the easiest recruitment processes that we had, because the religious leaders in the rural areas where we were working don't often get the chance to really study the Quran with other respected religious leaders. And so we had Sheikh Bashir, who is very well respected and also extremely enthusiastic and a dynamic trainer and leader. So we were lucky to have a respected Islamic leader to lead that process. But the local religious leaders were very interested in participating. For them, it was a great opportunity to study what they care quite a bit about in their daily lives and to really spend time on learning themselves. And we found that they were very interested in this.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, if I could comment here, I think this is a good example where maybe given the fact that you are focusing on resilience and gender specifically, the fact that we are talking about this and then kind of trying to think about what would be the nutritional linkages, to me that's already progress, because we are not going to be approaching a lot of our implementations with kind of like the blinders of what your particular expertise or key objectives are. And so it kind of gets you to a place where you think about, oh yeah, and how could nutrition in the household setting be a factor that kind of drives towards better food security outcomes. And so I think as implementation proceeds, we can kind of keep encouraging and finding those opportunities given the tools that IFPRI and other partners are producing.
Great. I had one more question that I wanted to direct to you, Audrey, from Corinne Garnier. How do you see this type of intervention being integrated into larger programs? I know Mercy Corps has a strategy for resilience that I think is integrated across a lot of your programs, and how does the Bridge initiative tie into this sort of larger resilience work that Mercy Corps is engaged in?
Absolutely, that's a great question. So Mercy Corps has an approach called the STRESS process, or Strategic Resilience Assessment process, that we've developed that we do in different countries where we work for different complex programs that we're implementing to identify, to take a systems development approach to how we're implementing our programming. And so it's an assessment process, and our measurement tools that we're developing will be, we hope will be able to be integrated into this approach that we're using in the future, so that we're starting to identify different dynamics around gender that specifically relate to the ability to strengthen household and community resilience to the climate and ecological shocks and stresses that we're identifying through the stress process. And as far as the interventions go, we also wanted to provide, what do you do? Decision making has been around for a while. This has been identified as an issue for resilience across many, many different frameworks and research processes. But what do you do about that? How do you actually start to address that and move the needle in any sort of meaningful way? And that's where we wanted to package interventions and approaches that programs can consider to integrate into their approaches already, so that they can start to address some of these underlying issues. And again, as mentioned, the scale issue is definitely one that we need to be considering as we're thinking of scaling up into much, much larger programs where we're working. And we're conducting research right now to look into what are some of these stronger linkages between household decision making and the outcomes that we're anticipating or hoping to see, and what are some of the core aspects of these interventions that really lead to change across broader communities, and how can we structure this in a way that makes sense for larger interventions.
I'm going to go back to one question on the framework. It says, for the framework developed by IFPRI, do you see this framework or method of developing the framework being used or adapted for other fields of work linked to gender and climate change? What potential do you see with this framework for adaptation or expansion? That's a good question. I think one of the things we grappled with when we were trying to draw this framework together from so many different bodies of literature is that a lot of times the literature, like for example on adaptation or climate smart agriculture or resilience, are talking about some of the same concepts but from a slightly different perspective. So I think the framework, as I showed, is somewhat adaptable. We did build in concepts about adaptation, livelihood resilience. So while I used climate smart agriculture as an example of the kinds of responses that we can think about, you can also think about adaptation in a broader sense in terms of livelihood resilience, livelihood diversification, migration, other kinds of strategies that households or communities or policymakers may use, investments in infrastructure, market linkages. These are all sort of adaptive responses to address climate shocks and stressors. So I think what we'd like to see eventually is the framework to be used and adapted for a particular project or for a program or project so that it's focusing on the sort of goals that that particular project has and the kinds of strategies that that particular project is using. And the household example, if, for example, if a project is targeting production practices at the household level and trying to increase resilience of production and productivity and maybe even mitigating, those are the goals, and you might want to focus on different climate smart practices at the farm level. But you can also look at other scales or other kinds of approaches as well, depending on what the objectives are. Okay. Another question, given the complexity of climate resilience, gender and nutrition linkages, can we develop simple guidelines that NGOs can use to ensure that projects focused on climate resilience also improve gender and nutrition outcomes? Yeah, that's one of the goals of this project in the next 9 months or so. We are hoping to develop specific tools that basically takes each element of the framework, has a sort of checklist of questions that can be considered and linked to a particular project, so that the project has things to consider during design, during implementation, and during M&E of their projects. And so we hope to have that available over the next several months for other projects to use.
Yeah, and if I can comment on that quick, under the new sort of automated directive system, the ADS of USAID, we have the climate risk screening and climate risk management template, and that's mandatory. So all missions and all new activities have to go through that. And I think with our work in Nigeria, for instance, we were able to sort of, as they are going through that process, which is sort of a stylized process of looking at what are the climate risks that any activity is going to have to look at. And by the way, this includes things like education programs or health programs, or so not just food security. So there's an opportunity there to actually learn from part of what you were able to accomplish with the Nigeria mission as an example, that kind of can filter down to NGOs and all the various partners implementing on the ground. So that's a resource that you can get in touch with us about.
We have another question here. Can you speak briefly about the information that informed the development of the GCAN framework, literature, experience, etc.? So the framework was developed basically drawing on the different bodies of literature that I mentioned in the presentation. So we looked at the literature on gender and climate change, the literature on resilience. We did a review paper on the climate change and nutrition linkages, and we drew a lot on that. And so we pulled different elements from all these different bodies of literature and put them together into this framework. And if you want more details on the literature that we use and how we did that, you can take a look at a chapter in this year's annual Trends and Outlooks report by RESACS. And there's a link on our website to find this chapter. And it basically goes through all the literature and then introduces the framework as the sort of outcome of this review. And there's also a policy brief on the framework that's available online. If you don't want to go into all of the details of the literature, you can take a look at that. We also did consult throughout this process, as Claudia mentioned in the very beginning of the presentation. This is sort of closing the loop of our attempt to put this framework together. We started with a workshop when this project began last year, and we pulled together lots of partners at USAID, their implementing partners together here in a workshop, and we presented the literature and sort of our initial review of that and where we thought the framework should go. And we got feedback from our the partners and others during that time. We presented earlier versions of this through a webinar last year and our engagements with missions, and so we've continued to refine it through these interactions and through these experiences and in talking with partners who are doing work on the ground. Okay.
There's a question just above if women's time is freed up.
Okay, let me read that for you. If women's time is freed up, what is your experience? Is it used for care, nutrition, or income asset accumulation purposes? How do you measure either? Soma independent. Okay, this is from Soma Chakrabarti.
Thanks. So we've looked into this in Niger after the pilot so far, and the main concrete finding that we had is when women had more time because husbands were participating in household chores more, that the main thing they did was actually participate in the community groups. So that's where we started to see those connections between the different capacities we were working on. There were women's groups in the communities where we're working, and that was the main thing that women wanted to do when they had more free time, was go to these group meetings that were building, again, of course, building social capital for women, but they were engaging at the group level in smaller level income generating activities. So this did contribute to additional income in some ways. We didn't really see that women were starting their own businesses when they had that time, but of course, with such a short amount of time, I would be surprised if we did see that at that level. And we'll be measuring this in Nepal soon as well in the next few months to see when, first of all, if there is increased time for women after the intervention has wrapped up, and then what women are doing with those times. Are they participating more in some of these group activities? Are they working on income generating activities? What are they doing at that time? Thanks.
Great. There's another question directed to you, Audrey. What learnings did Mercy Corps move from Niger to Nepal and Indonesia, if any?
Thanks. The couples dialogue intervention was developed in Niger. So this was developed, the programs were a little bit different in timing of their implementation for gender action plans. So the overall approach in Niger was developed in Niger for the couples dialogue, how they were structuring the trainings, the incorporation of particularly learning days, so the chance to really share out and really celebrate what the couples have done and share that with the broader community. So the basic framework for the couples dialogue intervention in Niger was shared with Nepal and used as the basis for them developing out their own approach. So hopefully what we hope to do by the end of this is look both at the Niger example and the Nepal example and develop a toolkit for a general approach to addressing household decision-making issues in communities using case studies from both country contexts.
Okay, there's another question here about how the regional gender behavior can be a guiding factor for climate-smart agriculture in the region or other developing country. I'm not 100% sure I understand the question, but I think maybe the important thing to point out here is that women's gender roles are different in every local context. So it's really important before you try to develop any kind of climate smart strategy or resilience program to consider what those roles are. And as Mercy Corps, I think Audrey showed, each country, they did an assessment and they found out what are the real barriers for women in that particular context. Is it market linkage? Is it decision making? And so again, with climate smart agriculture, you would want to try and identify, are women staying at home and not as involved in agricultural production as in some cases in South Asia, or are they engaged with small livestock? Are they actually the ones working in the field? Are they irrigating? Are they not? And it's going to vary dramatically in every context. So it's really important to understand that before the design of any program or approach. I don't know if you want to add something.
Thanks. No, I think you covered it. Thanks.
And I do one more thing. I think the point that Audrey made about looking at other social factors beyond gender, like the caste in the case of Nepal, is also important. So age is another factor. All of these sort of other social dynamics that are present in a community are important to consider at the design stage.
And particularly age too, because we see that the elderly are often even more cut off from a lot of the DRR activities and information and response than the younger populations are too.
We did that one. Okay, so there's another question here. Cross-sector partnerships and funding is crucial and often challenging for implementing integrated approaches. Have you faced challenges in this area? If so, how do you overcome or recommend overcoming them? I think this is really a challenge, and maybe I'll let my USAID partners here respond to this, because I think that's one of the things that they're trying to do with the GFSS is to integrate across different sectors and sort of development objectives, food security and resilience and all of these things. So maybe your approach to that is.
Yeah, so as you all well know, a lot of the funding that's sort of provided through the US government is oftentimes earmarked. So Congress wants us to have a very specific spending for a very specific purpose, and we cannot sort of get out of that. The key thing, however, is that these kind of frameworks and this kind of thinking can really kind of help us make sure we are leveraging so that we don't have biodiversity funding, water funding, funding that's maybe going toward education and so on, that's sort of just doing things independently and separately, but rather to think of how do we bring it together. So I think it's easier said than done, but it's possible, but it takes time and it takes resources. So one of the key things that we are sort of afforded by having this kind of a project and a framing like with GCAN is that there is the resource here to think what will be the easy solutions and the easy pathways to draw from a particular kind of funding. But actually within our global food security strategy and a lot of our agriculture funding, this is all within the purview. So in this instance, it's not really stovepiped from the standpoint, because each of those things are things that we have to deal with anyway. So if we're going to be achieving our objectives and our results. I don't know if others have insights, but.
And one point I want to make is timing may also be key. Designing multiple activity that might touch on some of the elements of the framework will be very helpful. Not waiting for one activity to finish before you start the other, but designing those activities at the same time, implementing them in the same area will also address something.
I have another question to USAID. How do you see this framework and CLA learning cycle interlinkages?
Yeah, so that's actually an important element. For those who may not know, this sort of the collaborating, learning, and adapting. For us, actually, this is part of our function as a bureau is that we really do want to collaborate, we want to learn, and we want to adapt. And so really it's following in the spirit of what we have with CLA that this activity was initiated. And I feel like we, even this opportunity we are having right now is one of the instances where we are sharing with a broader community and trying to think about what have we learned and in what ways can we incorporate it into our activities. So I can say directly that each of us within the Bureau of Food Security, we have technical staff as well as country support officers. A lot of them are very aware of this work, and we are trying to see how we bring that into country planning, project design, and so on. So it's really part of the core of CLA, I would say.
Okay, there's, I think, one last question here. Can you explain how other aspects of the value chain can be made more climate smart besides just at the production level? For example, you stated processing and storage as having more potential to build climate resilience. So yes, we gave the example of the processing and storage as one. I think, you know, expanding market linkages through improvements in infrastructure, giving access to different social groups, you know, access to the market, as Audrey mentioned. I think those are other climate smart practices that can help increase resilience along the entire value chain. I don't know if you have any other examples from the work that Mercy Corps has done.
Maybe as she moves on, I can comment that even prior to the farm, when you kind of think about inputs, whether it's seeds or fertilizer or how you use water, so that's pre-production. So there are ways to be climate smart also there, and I'm sure maybe there are others here who can comment on this. When you kind of think about climate resilient seeds as an example, so that's an input that goes into the production, but way past production into the market, in the storage and processing, but also just with consumer behavior and the storage, or is it the wasting and loss equation, that they are the important ways we can be quite climate smart. I don't know if
this is Alex DePinto speaking. One thing that comes to my mind as I hear you talking is the value of sort of information technology and proper connection to markets, right? Farmers. That could be another thing, that it's not necessarily production per se, but it's really about information in terms of prices and market outlets, which sometimes can break or make a project, the success of a particular practice.
And I would add that there are other strategies that are climate smart, like regional trade or insurance products. So there's lots of ways to think about climate smart agriculture that go beyond the production stage. You know, nutrition, marketing of nutritious foods. There's lots of other kinds of strategies that can be thought about. It looks like another question has come in. Can you explain the connection between these non-production interventions and climate smart? For example, increasing market linkages. Well, I think it depends on sort of which aspect of climate smart you're addressing. So increasing market linkages for a disadvantaged group may increase their resilience and their ability to adapt to climate changes that they're experiencing by giving them new sources of income. I'm not sure what other, like, you know, regional trade is another climate smart practice. If production is affected in one country, you know, the ability to trade with another country would allow them to have, you know, ensure adequate nutrition for their population during a time of a shock or a crisis. So there are lots of different ways that these practices can help people and countries sort of manage the climate shocks and stressors that they're facing in any given time.
Yeah, and one of the programs that Bridge is working with in Indonesia is focused on a bundling services approach that's combining savings and loans with crop insurance for corn farmers in the east of Indonesia, along with connections to input suppliers, agriculture technology, and then also providing a platform for sharing climate information, so sharing weather information as well. And so the program is actually working with a variety of different private sector partners to provide bundled services that provide that extra level of a safety net, along with the loans that make it possible for farmers to access the insurance as well. And so this is another approach that's not necessarily on the production side, that's aiming to help farmers be more prepared for the shocks that are repeatedly coming.
The whole concept with sort of resource use efficiencies is obviously very important during production stage, but even into value addition, packaging, processing, marketing, all the way to consumption, they are sort of important wins you can get in terms of really hitting those three climate smart targets with adaptation, with the mitigation, with the even productivity. That's sort of beyond the farm, and therefore, if you're using energy more efficiently, if you're using clean energy as an example, or if you're sort of finding ways that you don't waste resources from the standpoint, if you can kind of get, if you can get weather information or a seasonal forecast that says it's going to be a pretty poor outlook, you may avoid planting rice altogether. I think there's an example in Colombia about this, and that saves resources. It's being climate smart. So anyway, there are multiple ways to think about it really beyond the farm or the production stage.
Okay, and we had another question come in, I think for Audrey, who is funding the Indonesia program?
That Indonesia program is the Swiss Development Corporation.
Okay. And we have a question in the room. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Jennifer Baca talking. I work at Food for Peace, Gender and Youth. My question is for Audrey. One of the things that I've been interested in is how, this is looking at the intersection of gender and climate change issues, is how we can make the linkages across our interventions at the household level and towards the community level more powerful. One of the possible blockages or trouble that I've observed in some of the reports of the movie is interventions like the couples dialogue, which are fantastic, and they are having positive effects on the relationships between men and women within their households, are contributing to lower levels of intimate partner violence. This is a very good outcome. But this is occurring simultaneously with increased rates of gender-based violence more broadly in the community, particularly around drought, where maybe younger women who are, their common household duty is to walk and get water. And so we see that our interventions are really positive in terms of getting husbands to value the contributions of their wives within their households. But this change in attitudes isn't extending more towards relationships between men and women generally at a society level. So I'm wondering, what can we do to make sure a lot of those interventions that are focused at household level can continue or extend to have greater effects in the way women are treated more broadly and decrease gender-based violence more broadly?
I think that's a fantastic question, and I don't have the answer for you right now, but I can tell you what we've discussed and what we're looking at. First of all, the intervention with the couples itself in Indonesia, I don't think would have been effective by itself. I think we really needed to be working with religious leaders in the communities as well. It may again have had some discrete positive impacts at household levels. Like the example I shared from the one woman, that might have happened with just the couples dialogue intervention. But I don't think the broader shifts that we saw at community levels would have started to come about without the work with the religious leaders. So that's a huge piece of it. It's not just the one-on-one work with the couples. I actually imagine once we get to to scale with that would not be a major part of the intervention after all. So that's working from, and maybe not necessarily religious leaders, but who are the gatekeepers in the community, who have the power, who do people listen to in the community, how do we identify these people and work with them to start to shift change. And then combined with that, while we're working with these influential leaders in the communities, there's also a need to work on interventions at broader levels that start to cut down how women are how women are exposed to GBV at broader levels. I mean, you mentioned that they're traveling distances or more, they can be exposed to gender-based violence through a variety of different means. Post-disaster, one of the biggest issues that we looked at across multiple contexts, in Nepal in particular, post-earthquake, is the issue of water and water access. And if we, we can do quite a bit of social programming, and I think there's huge value in that, and I think we should be doing that. But if you can also provide water sources within a community, then you can nip an issue in the bud before it actually starts happening. So I very much believe in both approaches. We have to be working both from the social side, top down and bottom up, and then also putting in place practical measures that can start to that can really shift and prevent the risk and prevent violence just purely through access to capital and access to resources.
And one other point to add, if the intervention also is using CLA and doing constant learning, you should be able to get like some quick feedback or some unexpected impact in that, from that intervention, and make shifts before the end of the intervention itself.
And I think that your point about bottom up and top bottom is very important, because there are certainly a lot of things you do targeting households and individuals in order to sort of effect a behavior change, and whereas you really cannot legislate behavior and attitudes, there are some key policy levers that you can use. So that's actually a huge front that the Bureau for Food Security sort of invests quite a bit in, working with governments and community and countries all over the places we do work to look at policy issues, to really kind of provide easy sort of wins that we can get from the policy side.
Great, and I think that is the last of our questions. So we are going to conclude now. I just want to mention again that we will have a recording of this event available online. We'll send an email to everyone who registered so that you can have a link to the recording. Yes, the recording will have both the slides and the narration or the audio recording of this event. So that will be circulated to all of you, and we hope you'll sign up for our newsletter and check out our website and join us for the next webinar. Thank you so much for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.